I tell like people who aren't as seasoned as us, I'll say, well, here we make a shiny, pretty Les Paul like we did in 1959, and they make it look as if it was made in 1959. They do fabulous work. And they do more reissues to where it has to adhere to the historic standards, where here we can change some things and have a little bit of freedom, you know, as long as we stay within the lanes of what's accepted of Gibson, sure. Right? And that's what we have to do. Sometimes younger people don't understand that. They'll say, hey, I have this drawing, why don't you make something like that? And it'll look like some spaceship pointy thing. And I'm like, well, you know, if we weren't called Gibson, we might be able to do that. But with Gibson, you have to honor what our fans expect of Gibson. So while we have, you know, a very diverse product lineup and many models, even futuristic Flying Vs and Explorers, which were designed in response to the space race of the 50s, by today's standards, we have to kind of stay within that, right? We'll start on the body line. We'll make our way over to ES. And then we'll, as we get done with ES, we'll talk about the solid bodies. This enclosure is for some new CNC machines. We just got these last month, so we had to put up this enclosure. So those are, I think we have 4 of them in there, 3. We kept the 4th one in the R&D lab. I'm in charge of R&D, so my team will use one of those to develop programs for that model and then introduce them to manufacturing. This is where the ES models start. So ES models are comprised of 3 wood veneers, maple, poplar, and maple. This is the center ply of poplar. Notice the grain is going this direction. The maple will run lengthwise. So it starts out with maple. We apply adhesive with a paint roller. We'll actually have a paint roller and pan like you use at home. We have put a special adhesive that's a heat-cured adhesive. So we apply a layer of that adhesive, then we put on the poplar, apply the second layer of adhesive, and then the final layer of maple. Then we put it in the press. That's still warm. And it was shut down for several hours. It's heated up to 230 degrees. And the heat is required to cure the glue. So when the press comes down, you can see the veneer is pretty pliable. You don't really need to have the press to warp it, but just to hold it in place securely. Then after 3 minutes, you can pull it out, and it will basically be shaped like so. And then on that rack back here, it holds it into that shape as it cools down so it doesn't contort or twist, right? And then after that, over here on that bandsaw, we slice it like bread. So the pressing that wide will get enough rims for 3 guitars. So by default, every guitar has a matched set of rims coming out of the same pressing. We'll glue the center block to the rim assembly, and we make all this fixturing in-house. Sometimes I get more excited about the fixturing than I do the guitars. It's just very crafty what they come up with. So we make this, glue it together. There's a timer so we know we can pull it out of the clamps. Then here, we glue the kerfing, which starts out in long strips, and it's kerfed, which means that action of slicing it, that's kerfing the wood, makes it more pliable, although in this short, it's cracking. But it'll be long lengths. We glue it in here with conventional wood glue and have to use spring clamps. So that's all done by hand. These are awaiting that process. After the liner strips are glued in, we run it through that thickness sander, and that'll true off that surface in preparation for the top and back. Now we're going to back up and look at the top press. So the tops are laminated the same way the rims are laminated. You put the maple down, then the poplar, then the maple with the same adhesive, but we stage it here with these pins to hold it in place. We'll get one done, put it on the rack, get a second part done, and then we'll take both parts, put one here and the other in here. And then that press comes down, and in 3 minutes, it's cured. And if you can see the contour of the ES, at this point it could be either a back or a top, okay? And then we take it and put it on the cooling rack. The interesting story about this machine, we made the dies specific to our operation pressing ES tops.
But the green part, the press itself, and we also added the electronics for the heating elements, you know, to cure the glue. But the press itself, Gibson bought in 1946, used. So it went from Kalamazoo to Nashville to Memphis, back to Nashville. So when we moved it back here, the hydraulics, it uses oil pressure for the hydraulics. It was leaking almost as much oil as a 70s 19 Harley Davidson. But we fixed it. And in the process, we were looking up the history of the machine. We bought it used, as I said. Before we bought it, it started life during World War I, pressing artillery shells for the US military during World War I and World War II. So there's a lot of history in that machine. And now it's serving us civilians in a much better, you know, way. After the tops are pressed, we'll take a hand drill. When we press the contour into the top, it has a feature that embosses a little dimple in the top, and we'll take a hand drill and drill that out, and then we'll use that hole to locate the fixture that will hold that brace in place. Every ES top and back has this brace that's glued in, and at this point we'll use conventional aliphatic resin wood glue. So you apply glue to the brace, and we have a fixture that locates on those pins on the top, and we'll get two parts and then slide it into that bladder clamp behind you. And as you can see here, at this point, they could be two tops, two backs, or one of each. They're synonymous at this point. This is the fixture that holds that brace into position. That's a tire. That valve makes that tire inflate, and that's the clamp that clamps that brace into both parts at the same time. That's another thing that we made here in-house. Actually a Goodyear tire too. Once that's done, then we load it on the machine, and at this point, this half of the machine has the fixture to machine the center core. So that will load in here and we'll machine the center core here. That will machine the top and back. So it'll start out rectangular, and then we'll key in the program and it'll machine this surface. It uses that big fly cutter to surface that in preparation to glue it to the core, and then it'll machine the perimeter. That would be the finished part. We used to machine the F-holes and the control holes here, but now we do that much later down the line, which I'll show you later. This would be the finished core assembly. And over here we have those bladder clamps. And if you can see in between the two fixtures, there's a nylon form. And the rim assembly will sit in that nylon form, and we'll apply glue to one surface, and then we'll put either the top or back on, flip it over, put glue to the opposite surface, put the other top or back on, and then we slide it inside the bladder clamp, and then we'll simultaneously glue the top and back on in one shot. Again, we made those fixtures, and it's a very efficient and crafty way of doing that. After that, in that rack, that would be the finished product after we take them out of the bladder clamps. You can see there's about 1/4 of an inch material extending from the rims, and then we'll trim that off at the shaper. So we trim them on that shaper, and it'll trim off that excess material, and it'll also channel it for the binding. The binding is the plastic trim that will dress off the seam where the top and back joins the rim assembly. The binding is done here. These days we use ABS plastic instead of celluloid for binding. Celluloid can break down and disintegrate after 50 or 60 years. So now we use ABS plastic because it won't do that. The adhesive we use is basically ground up ABS plastic into a powder that we mix with acetone and some other solvents, so it actually melts into the binding, which allows a better glue surface with less chance of a dark seam using a different epoxy or a different adhesive. The process itself in applying it is the rope method, and it's about the only process we do the same way that we've been doing for 130 years making guitars and mandolins. When they bind, they'll take a work board like this, clamp it into the fixture, then they'll get the body they're going to bind, and then they'll get the binding, and in this glue trough, behind each workstation is that glue that is specific to glue on the binding. They'll put it in one end, pull it out the other opening, and the entire piece is slathered in that goopy glue. Then they'll hold the binding around the butt end of the body, hold it down at the waist, and then they get that rope and start that rope method wrapping it around the body. So this would be the finished body. So they'll take that C-clamp off once they get it held down here, because that rope is then holding it to the workboard. Then they continue the binding process, and if you compare all the same models with the sequence of the wraps, every model has the same wrap sequence. And that's what takes, on average, 2 months to train these craftspeople how to do this operation. We have to have the same sequence of wraps to ensure you have the proper tension in the waist, on the tip of the horns, and in the cutaways. And every model has a different sequence of operation. After they're done, they'll pencil a time. That way they know how long they can let it set. It has to be a minimum of 4 hours before they can unwrap it and do the second surface. They can only do one surface at a time. This would be a Les Paul body as it's supplied from the rough mill. At the rough mill, we'll process the lumber into the appropriate size body blanks. The maple tops, if they're a figured maple top, it'll come in 2 inches wide or 8/4. We split it down the center and then open it up like a book. And you can open it up like this or like that. So you choose whichever configuration provides the most figure in the center of the guitar. You edge laminate that, and then you laminate it onto the body. Then we have a CNC machine that holds 20 bodies. We'll have 10 of them face up, 10 of them back up. We'll key in the program, and it'll carve the top on one side and then drill the control holes in the neck mortise. And on the other side, it will machine the round over, and then the switch cavity and the control cavity, and then the outside perimeter. At this point, they send it up in this configuration, or in this condition. If you feel, you can feel scallops, and that's just the scallop from the ball nose cutter that carves that top. And when we finish sand it, this one is a studio, so it's not going to have binding. But if it had binding, it would already be channeled, and then we'd apply binding first, and then we do the rim sanding, and then the top sanding. This guitar will go directly to rim sanding, and then top sanding. This would be a figured maple top, a 2A top. So we'll use single A or plain, 2A, 3A, and 4A tops, depending on the model. And the flame is just a mutation in the wood. You can't intentionally grow it, which is why it's more costly to get. Of course, the Flying V. So at this point, this is what is supplied from the rough mill in this condition. Left-handed juniors. Solid bodies are bound here. We segregate or separate the solid bodies and ESs just so the team can focus on those product lines. This CNC machine is surfacing the neck surface in preparation for joining the neck. So at that point, what that machine is doing is just surfacing that with the proper pitch in preparation for gluing on the neck. Thank you, Art. So that's the work it just did. And then notice it still has to be rim sanded and the top sanded. So those big, we have rim sanding spindle sanders over there. Over here with the yellow screens on top, that's a slack belt sander. As the name implies, it's a big belt sander that's slack in the middle, and it sits down on the table, and the table moves in and out, and you wad up a rag into a ball, and you press it on the inside of that sanding belt, and it'll form inside the contour of an ES top or a Les Paul top. And then when you do the back surface, we'll have a wooden block lined with felt, and you just true up that back surface. After all the work at ES and solid body is approved, the final inspector has to approve it before it can then be given to the line across the aisle, which is neck fit. So here, all these necks are finished and approved, and they'll be mated up to the appropriate bodies. We have misters that will shoot out cool water vapor. It'll look like smoke, but it's just cool water vapor to maintain between 40 and 50% moisture content in the factory. We have a dozen kilns, most of them are in the rough mill, we only have one of them here, to equilibrate the wood and stabilize it, but it can still expand and contract, which is why you get fret sprout and that sort of thing. If we were making our guitars out of plastic and metal, we wouldn't have to do what we do at Neck Fit, but because wood can still expand and contract, we have to make the tenon larger than the body, right? So when we get to the neck fitter, they have to use a chisel and chisel this neck tenon to fit the body because it can expand and contract. So we intentionally make it too large so then we can control it at the very last minute. Once they're done, they verify the pitch off of the height of the body and then the alignment off a center line, and then they clamp it together with one clamp, and then it will sit in the rack there, dry for a half hour before it can go down the line. This is a neck as we receive it from the rough mill. At the rough mill, neck stock starts out 31 inches long by 12-quarter square, which is 3 inches square. And we have a rotary profiler machine. The next 6 necks are loaded on that, and it rotates around 4 different cutters. One cutter will cut part of the neck, then it'll rotate, cut that surface, rotate, cut that surface, rotate, surface the headstock, rotate, slot it for the truss rod. Then we glue the truss rod in, which is basically a bolt, and the head is held captive. There's a square feature on the head of the bolt that locks into a rectangular washer so it can't turn. And then when the neck bows, you tighten that bolt and it wants to straighten itself out. That's the theory of the truss rod. Gibson invented the truss rod in 1921. Virtually every company who makes a steel string guitar with a wood neck uses the truss rod, thanks to Gibson. That was our invention. But because patents are only good for 17 years, everybody's free to use it. So it's all good. But a lot of people don't understand Gibson actually invented it. The other cool part of the story, not only did it allow adjustability, because it allowed adjustability and a stronger neck, now we're able to make a thinner neck. Prior to the truss rods, Gibson necks, or any steel string guitar neck, was very deep. I just restored a 1916 L3 for myself, and it has a huge neck, V-shaped, because it was prior to the truss rod. And now with the slim neck, think back guitar music. You know, during that era, the first part of the 20th century, guitar music was solo, duo, or small combos. Either strumming, folk, or that style of music, to finger style, maybe parlor or classical style. Now with a thin neck, now guitar players like Charlie Christian are added to big bands like Benny Goodman's band. He was hired to pound out rhythm, right? Now he's exposed to clarinets and other horns playing single note solos. Now he has a slim neck that allows himself to play up the neck and a pickup that allows those little notes to be heard. So the truss rod and the electromagnetic pickup both facilitated the development of guitar solo music like we know it. The first thing we do with the neck once it arrives here is apply wood glue to the surface of the headstock. And then we have a clamp caul that holds the head veneer. The head veneer already has the inlay in it, and we use phenolic here, which also reinforces the headstock. You put the headstock on the locator pins, then it goes into the fixture, like so, and then you hit the valve, and that's fire hose, and the fire hose inflates, and that's the clamp that clamps the head veneer to the neck. And then that stays in the clamp for a half hour, and then when it's dry, then we can pull it out, and then you'll have the head veneer glued to the neck. Behind us is the R&D lab. I'm the R&D manager as well as master luthier, so my team and I develop all the prototypes, and this is our little factory within the factory. So once we finish new prototypes and they get approved, then we make fixtures as required for manufacturing, and then give manufacturing the programs and the fixtures, and then introduce the new models into manufacturing. I named the R&D lab after George Matthews, who's one of my employees who reached his 40-year milestone a few years ago. Now he's over 42 years. But he's such a valued member of the team that I named the R&D lab after George. So here we have the head veneer glued on. Now we have to carve the back of the neck. So we have these locator holes that are used for various functions in locating in various fixtures. So we'll put it on the neck carver, and the neck carver has dowels that locate the neck in position. Then we pull that valve, and that has a vacuum. Now you can't pull that neck off of the fixture. We'll load that up to here, which holds 10 necks. And then this holds another 10. We divide it 2 tables of 10 so we can have one cycle while we're loading up the other. And then above each station is a router, and you key in the program, hit start, and then it'll go back, pick up the cutter, and then simultaneously carve 10 necks at one time. When it's done, that would be the finished product off the neck carver. This is before and that's after. And you can see it's close, a lot farther along than the before, but there's still a lot of work that has to go in there afterwards. First thing that happens after carving, guitars are staged here. We take a fingerboard, we process the fingerboards on that side of the room, and we install a dowel pin on the fingerboard, which coincides with the locator holes on the neck. So when we glue it on, it won't shift out of place. We also have an RFID tag. That's the chip, and that's the antenna. So when we complete the fingerboard, we scan it. After we glue it on, it's held captive in there. So as it goes through the factory, we scan every department, and that's our inventory management and tracking system. When we glue the fingerboard on, we'll apply the wood glue to the neck, put it on top of the fingerboard. We'll put it on a clamp call, then we load it into the fixture. We hit the valve, and that fire hose inflates up, and it conforms perfectly to all the irregularities along that surface. So it's the perfect clamp pressure to clamp the neck to the fingerboard. It'll dry for a minimum of a half hour, then we can pull it out. Here we hand roll necks. So after we glue the fingerboard on, we have to sand off the excess material that extends past the fingerboard. And then you have to blend in the neck into the headstock and into the heel of the neck, right? So that's all done here by hand. So they have to hold a neck like this on this belt sander. They have their calipers and straight edges and contour gauges to make sure, you know, and check their work. So they do this all by hand, and that's what we feel. So I like to say CNC machines make great guitar parts, but people make great guitars. And the CNC machine, like I said earlier, makes 10 parts at one time, where in the old days you'd have one part at a time. Now that's multiplied, actually by 20, because we have 2 tables of 10. And now one person can run that. Now we can afford to have people doing these operations that still have to be done by hand. This machine, if you notice that, has that's a fixture. You load a neck in here, and that cutter has the same shape as the scroll, the top of the headstock. So you put a neck in, that shaper when it's running, and you wipe it across there, and then it will cut that final scroll into the top of the neck. This is the hot stamp machine. So the hot stamp machine will apply the artwork to the plastic parts. So you'll load it on the machine like so, and this is an ink ribbon, and it's placed across the part, and then you hit these 2 buttons, and it comes down, and it'll emboss through heat and pressure the artwork on the plastic part. And then we put a piece of plastic on it to keep it from getting scratched. These would be various dies that we have. That would be a Firebird die for a Firebird pickguard. Here we're drilling the locator holes on the fingerboards, and then he'll load them on that CNC machine, and then it will machine the inlays for the fingerboards. That's the first thing we machine on the fingerboards. Then we epoxy in the inlays, and then we surface it to true up the surface with the inlays, and then we slot it, and then we fret it.
So frets are last.
The frets are last. That way you're not introducing
Oh, and then
glue
binding,
inside, yeah, binding if it is bound.
Yeah.
We machine for the bridge, tailpiece, and pickups. After neck fit, notice there's no pickups, bridge, or tailpiece. In the old days, you would naturally do all that work with pin router technology. Now we figured out it's better to leave that off. After the neck is glued on, then we put it on that machine, and we have self-centering clamps that the neck is clamped into with self-centering clamps to make sure it's on perfect center. Then we machine the bridge, tailpiece, and pickups, so everything is perfect in line. So if you look at guitars Gibson made prior to, I think, the early 2000s when we started doing this process, like I always like to say that 1959 $350,000 Les Paul, and if you look at the bridge saddles, you're not going to see the strings in the center of the saddles very rarely, because there's just that. And so what they would do is they would string up the guitar in final assembly, eyeball the two E strings to center them up on the fingerboard, smack it with a hammer, and then file it, and then eyeball the remaining strings, smack it with a hammer, then file it. Now we can have our bridges pre-notched on perfect center because now we can machine it on perfect center. Another example why guitars today are actually made better than they were back in the golden age. Now here, this is a ES330, so it's fully hollow. Notice no F-holes or control holes. We just do the bridge holes because we use that to locate for the Pleck. So after finish and buffing, that's already been buffed out, we'll put it on that same machine and we'll machine for well, in this case, no tailpiece because it has a trapeze, but we'll machine the control holes, the F-holes, and the pickups after it's been buffed and finished. That way we're not introducing potential contamination in finishing or inside the guitar from overspray. So if you're familiar with the Plex, you know what we do in here. We have 10 of them. We got our first one in the early 2000s, and at one point only Gibsons of a certain price point up were Pleck. Now we have 10 of them in this room. Each Pleck is over 200,000 nowadays, and so it's a couple $1 million worth of Plex. But now, depending on the shift, here we have 2 people running it. First shift we have 3 people running it. Normally you'd have 30 to 40 people running it. So the Pleck is a CNC fret leveling and honing process. And so every model has its own specific program and fixtures. So you first put it in this fixture that, as she's doing, loads it in, and then she'll key in the model, and then it will put tension on the neck to simulate string pressure, and then she'll verify it with this gauge, and then it'll be ready to load in the machine. Then once it's loaded in the machine, then it starts the scanning process. We key in the program specific for that model. It'll start scanning, which is basically a plunger type of deal that indicates off the fretboard surface, and then it scans every string path, about so slow. Once it's done, it has a digital topographic map of the entire fret surface. It'll, one by one, it'll machine, maybe take 1,000th off of here, maybe 2,000ths here, maybe skip here, and so forth. Every fret can be different, and it'll take it to the right plane and the right profile, and then lastly, it'll slot the nut. So everything is guaranteed to be, on center with the nut spacing. So it's a lot of work. The average cycle time is 8 to 10 minutes, depending on the model. So it's a lot of very critical work that's done in a very short time period. And so that's it there. So in color prep, guitars get their final sanding in preparation for finish. Then they get the wood fill, which is a paste wood filler that fills the pores on open wood like mahogany or swamp ash or woods like that have open pores. If it's a solid closed grain wood like maple, you don't grain fill that. So in the case of a Les Paul, you would only grain fill the mahogany neck and then the mahogany back, but the maple face of a Les Paul, you don't grain fill. On an ES, because it's a maple outer ply, you would only wood fill or grain fill the neck, which is mahogany, but you wouldn't grain fill the maple of the body. Then the grain filler has to dry for 8 hours minimum, then it can go into finishing. Or if the guitar has a stain, that would also be applied here. Some of the ESs will have a pre-finished stain that we apply to pop the grain, as will some maple tops on Les Pauls, depending on the color. Either way, it dries for 8 hours, then it can go into finishing. This is walnut wood filler on mahogany. If you look inside here, you can see the mahogany without the wood filler. That has walnut wood fill. This is the same mahogany with mahogany wood filler. So we'll tint the wood filler to accent the grain depending on the color of the guitar. These are Les Paul bodies that we have the initial stain and the walnut wood filler on. And we'll have a 2-letter color code inside the neck pickup pocket, and that tells us what color to spray. Every model will have its color code in the pickup pocket. Now we can go into finishing. The smell of victory. But we have adequate, you can smell it, but it's not going to be harmful, because in our spray booths, we have the vacuums that are OSHA approved not to require respirators. That's up to the sprayers themselves, you know, so they don't have to wear respirators. It's entirely up to them. On the other side of that wall, we have a spray booth that only does metal flake finishes, and that's isolated so we don't get metal flake particles contaminating other colors. On the other end of the room, we have our spray booths. We have the shade booths and the sealer. All guitars will get a nitrocellulose sanding sealer in preparation for the color. And then once we apply color, that's all done by hand. So all sparkle finishes are done in that isolated spray booth. And then we have another line upstairs that is isolated to only do white and TV yellow and colors like that. And then down on the floor, I call it general population. That's like all the sunbursts and the wood tones that aren't as susceptible to picking up contamination. So that's all down here. 2-digit letter code inside the pickup pocket. That tells the sprayer what color the guitar will be. That way, we still try to group like things together. Oh, let me cut off. She's spraying the center yellow in the center of a sunburst. Now she's spraying a coat of clear, and that will show her progress, and it'll pop the color. And it'll also protect the color when it goes through scraping. So now, that's how color is applied by skilled craftspeople. How cool. If you look in there, and here we can look at it from a distance, but we don't want to get in and do all the nitty-gritty of it. It's electrostatically applying the clear lacquer. So because we have a truss rod in the neck, if you notice on this side of the room, guitars hang from the eyelet at the end of the butt, and that allows the sprayer to hold the neck while they're spraying the guitar, and then lastly spray the neck. Here, guitars hang by the headstock, and there's a wire that connects the hanger to the truss rod, so that conducts a low voltage charge to the instrument. The finish has the opposite, so it's electrostatic, and that's what's applying the clear coat of lacquer to the guitar. You let skilled people apply the color and do the shading, because skilled people have to do that, because the wood colors can change. You couldn't automate that because, let's say, for instance, 2 maple tops could be lighter or darker. A skilled person has to control that, you know, and lean in or pull back, speed up or slow down. With clear, you're just applying 6 coats on average of clear lacquer. Now you want that automated because you want to apply that millage with a uniform coating and less overspray. So, and Custom Shop doesn't even do that, because for their operation, it wouldn't make good financial sense because it's very costly. So it does work out when you're doing high volume for us. There's certain things that you can automate. You know, clear, you're just applying multiple coats of clear, and there you want to apply millage, and it's clear. So it makes sense to automate it because now you got uniform coating thickness and coverage with less overspray. But to your point, that sunburst, you know, wood color may change, and that sprayer has to be able to hold that. And then, because it's done by hand, it's kind of like art, and no two are exactly the same, just as 2 pieces of wood aren't exactly the same. Yeah. Clear, or after the color is applied, then we go into scraping, which we're going to see shortly. After scraping, they come out here, and then this is the first quality control inspection point.
They have to approve the work that the sprayers did and the scrapers. Then it can be given to the other side of the room for the clear coat application. Here's where we silk screen the artwork on the headstock. So in the case of the Les Paul standard style guitar, the gold Les Paul model is applied with silk screen, and then the Gibson is in mother of pearl. So we apply the silk screen here. You can see the silk screen there. So we have locator pins that locate on the headstock. The guitar is staged here, locating on those pins. The silk screen comes down, she applies the gold ink, and then squeegees it with this squeegee, and that forces the ink through the perforated holes on the screen onto the headstock. Little trivia. You know when they first started screen printing on t-shirts?
No.
Music industry trivia.
77.
Earlier.
53.
Earlier.
No.
Oh, no, later, I'm sorry.
60?
63. 63 or 64? I think 64. Beatlemania.
Yeah.
Beatlemania.
Shirts. Yeah.
Yeah. So here is scraping. If you notice, this is a classic cherry red ES model, and we paint over the binding. If we mask it, it's kind of like doubling up the work because you'd still have to come back and scrape anyway. And so the scrapers all have different scraping blades. You can see a big variety they have, all different, oops, sorry to make a mess, all different shapes and sizes. And then they hold that blade with their thumb and index finger. You might want to come around that side. So they hold the blade between their thumb and index finger, and they have to scrape that color off of the binding. So it requires a great deal of skill. The scrapers typically train for 6 months before they can go prime time. And it's typically women who make the cut. There's one guy on first shift who made the cut. And I can scrape. I scraped my first guitar in 1980 on a Les Paul I refinished. And I could certainly do it, but if she's absent and I'm going to try to cover for her, they'll pull me off by first break because I wouldn't be able to keep up the pace. Women have that finesse and that skill where they can do this job very accurately and very quickly. Guys try out, but only one made the cut in this location. And we're very proud of the scrapers. They do tremendous work. And Gibson's known for their binding detail, and this is a big part of the why. And it'll take, on average, on an ES like that, it's double bound on the front and back and on the fingerboard. It'll take, on average, about 45 minutes. You have to get that, she's getting the corner there now, and then she'll move in for the very top. After the guitars are dry and finishing, they come down this carousel from the finishing department into neck prep. In neck prep, they remove the masking tape off the fingerboard that prevents lacquer from getting on it. Then they'll have to clean up the residual lacquer that creeps up under the tape, scrape that clean, polish up the frets and fretboard surface, and then if they have binding nibs, they have to file and shape the binding nibs. So what Darlene's doing is filing the binding nibs and the binding flush. That all has to be done by hand.
That's incredible.
It's incredible the amount of work that goes into the binding nibs. After she's done there, then she'll finish it off with some fine grit sandpaper and then steel wool, and that'll polish up the frets and fretboard surface. You know, there's a lot of handwork, you know, and that's one thing we're very proud of. This is the biggest craftery, and Cesar coined that, and that perfectly describes what we do. Because it's not just a factory, it's a craftery. There's so many hand operations that we have to do, and you know, you can't just automate everything.
No.
And so, you know, dressing the frets, you know, here at this stage, cleaning them up, polishing them, filing the binding nibs, you know, shaping the neck, setting the neck. There's just so many things that have to be done by skilled craftspeople. And we're very proud of that. And that's what really makes our guitars special. So in buffing, the first thing we do is sand
the finish down, let me grab a guitar to show you. So this would be a guitar as it enters buffing. So I don't know if you can see the detail here, but the finish, while it's kind of shiny, it's not shiny enough. It still has a lot of orange peel, but that's just what the finish looks like when it comes out of finishing. A lot of people think that shiny coat is what the last coat of paint looks like, but it's not. You can see the orange peel and the grain. So here, if we watch this gentleman, he's sanding down that finish, and when he's done, it'll look like frosted glass. And that'll make that surface as flat as glass, so when we buff it on the buffing wheels, it'll bring that luster and sheen back without all that orange peel. When we buff, we have various buffing compounds. We don't want to go too deep.
Yeah.
And we have different width wheels. So they'll start out first on the red wheels, which are on that side. The red wheels have the more coarse grit compound, and the buffing compound is in a wax bar. The red is the more coarse. And it comes in a block that's, you know, this square, but it starts out about so long. And this is worn down, as you can see, and this is worn down even more. So it's buffing compound like you would use on your car, but instead of being in a liquid, it's in a wax matrix. So you take that bar and you rub it onto the wheel, that wax melts and it sticks to the wheel. That way we don't get liquid spatter, we get powder, which is a lot better for mess than all that liquid spatter. So you rub that on the wheel. We use the red to do the initial passes on buffing because it's more coarse. And then once we're done with the red, then we move on to the white, and that's a finer grit, and then that brings it to a higher sheen, and then we take it to a clean wheel with a liquid spray polish, and that finishes it off. So it's very physical. If you know the weight of a guitar, and imagine, you know how rough it is to play 4 sets a night wearing a guitar, you know? A lot of people don't realize, you know, that's some work, right? Well, now imagine 8 hours a day buffing a guitar, the weight of a guitar, and then you're forcing it into a buffing wheel and holding on so it doesn't grab it out of your hands. That makes the guitar weigh even more. So it's very physical. So the buffers typically, you know, earn a higher hourly rate than other operations because it's so physical. And I call it the young man's game because I'm old and I have my readers, and I can buff a guitar, but after an hour, my eyes give out. Even though it's very physical, my arms don't give out as much as my eyes. So I have to take a break. All these young guys, their arms are like my thighs, you know, these guys are bulked out. They're brutes. They do it 8 hours a day, and I'm not gonna get in a butt kicking contest with these guys. But they do tremendous work, and not only is it physical strength, but they have to have finesse. Because when you get around a sharp binding edge or a sharp headstock edge, you have to have that finesse to get in there and buff, but not let that edge burn or get snagged. So it's a very, very skilled operation. And you know, that's why the buffers, you know, and again, our lacquer finish, you know, we're known for that true nitrocellulose lacquer finish, the depth in that gloss, and that's courtesy of this department. Now we're in final assembly. After buffing, guitars come into final assembly. Dave and Lee are the material handlers that will then populate these parts bins specific to each model. This one they're still working on. Here you can see we have the control assembly, the pickups. We make the pickups next door. Some of them are quick connect. In this case, this is a quick connect assembly. Let me add too, the quick connect assemblies and the hand wired assemblies both use the same carbon element on the inside of the pots, which are a vintage taper CTS carbon element. And then the quick connect are on a circuit board, and it has a ground plane on the bottom. Otherwise, the circuitry is the same. It facilitates manufacturing of certain models because it's snapped together, and on push-pull it's more reliable than if it was hand-wired, because most failures are when a pot works loose and snags a wire. So having it on a circuit board will definitely help that. And for those of you out there in TV land, no, it does not sound any different. However, we do hand-wired for the original series because that's what people expect. It looks the part, and that's how it was done back in the day, so that's how we do it. But on our higher volume modern series guitars, then we use PC board. But they still have the same CTS made pots. Even the push-pull pots, while they look different, still have that same internal element. So they're not going to sound any different.
That's a good clarification, because I know.
I know.
You know how the internet
I know, that's why I wanted to point that out. A little free information to help all of our businesses, right? So once they are done populating the parts kit, then they go to the build line. And now we have the build line divided into single piece flow and with bench build. And we're going back to bench build on a lot of our models because as we discovered with single piece flow, certain models work with single piece flow, but you can't just have single piece flow on all the lines because let's say for instance an ES model followed up by SG Junior. They're not going to be built at the same rate. An ES will require a lot more time going down the line than SG Junior or Les Paul Junior. So now, we have certain models going down the single piece flow line and certain bench built, and then you have more pride on bench built too, because now you got more skin in the game and more pride because that one person is building that guitar individually. So it works out both ways, but for the more complicated ones, we're going back to bench build. Either way, they go down the line, get built up, and then they make it to the final inspector. We can see that coming up. Notice here we'll pre-populate strings on the tail pieces. This just makes it quicker when we're assembling the guitars. They can just pick up a tail piece, drop it on the guitar, and build it up. But more importantly than that, if you're doing it one at a time, you have more of a chance of scratching it. And that's how we all do it at home, right? But in a factory, if you don't have to do it one at a time, it's quicker and less chance of scratching. Now we get to the end of the line, and the final inspector, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm doing well. We'll have to fill out the pre-pack checklist. So he'll have to check off of all that criteria and approve it. Then he'll initial it, date it, put the model SKU, and then the serial number. Once he approves that guitar then and checks this out, then he'll scan it and that'll enter it into our system, and it'll also print out the tag that will accompany the guitar on the box, on the carton. He puts the guitar in a rack, and then once the rack is filled up, then it goes into the packing department, and then the packers will put the guitar in the appropriate gig bag or case inside the carton, and then it goes into the warehouse, and that's the end of the line.